Hello, you guys. So, today we will be continuing the analysis on Jane Eyre. So, we'll be analyzing chapter 21 to chapter 25. So, in these chapters, we will get to know more about Rochester and Jane and how they will get closer, and we will learn more about the Reeds in chapter 21. So, when Jane was 6, she heard Miss Sabbat and Bessie saying that having dreams about children indicates bad luck. Jane has been having dreams about children for 7 days. So basically, this is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when, something in the story or a specific line or quote is leading to something in the future. One morning, she wakes up and is informed that her cousin John has taken his own life and Mrs. Reed is requesting to see her. Mrs. Reed was ill, then she suffered a stroke. Jane needed to notify Mr. Rochester that she needed to go to Gateshead for a week. Mr. Rochester was hesitant. He gave her £50 even though he only owed her 15. Jane refused to take the £50, so he took the rest and left her with £5. That way she will come back to take the rest of her salary. So basically, Jane was requesting of Mr. Rochester to go to see, her family, and Mr. Rochester gave her £50. Jane only owed him £15. Well, he actually only owed Jane £15, but Jane refused to take the £50, being the person with strong morals and being the polite person she is. She refused. So in the end, he only gave her £5. That way, she will come back to take the £10. That way, she won't leave and not come back. That way, she will have something that is left at Thornfield that she needs to take. So, she does not catch the sight of Mr. Rochester for the rest of the day. The next morning, Jane leaves early to Gateshead. When she arrived, Mrs. Reed was sleeping. She sees her cousins after 8 years of being apart. Eliza was simple and wore a skirt to her knees. She was very plain. She had a very plain style. Georgiana was still beautiful and a little less cold than her sister. Jane asks about Mrs. Reed, and Eliza says that she does not like to be bothered in her sleep. Jane went to Mrs. Reed's room. She knew exactly where it was, so basically Jane remembered because 8 years isn't a long time. Once she arrives, she finds Mrs. Reed awake. She breaks the vow she said 8 years ago by calling Mrs. Reed auntie. So, if you don't remember, there was this specific quote where Jane said, here in chapter 4. I'm glad you are no relation to mine. I will never call you auntie again as long as I lived. But Jane, being the sweetheart she is, she did end up breaking the promise. So, where were we? Okay, the next few days, Jane learns more about her cousins Eliza and Georgiana. So we need to go down a bit. Eliza and Georgiana. They were polar opposites, so you can call them foil characters, but not really. They have not gotten along ever since Georgiana ran away with that lord. Jane visits Mrs. Reed again. She learns that her uncle John Eyre wanted to adopt her. So John Eyre is her paternal uncle. Always remember that paternal uncle, her father's brother. But Mrs. Reed told him that Jane had died at Lowood because, at Lowood there were many illnesses, and basically Mrs. Reed told John Reed that Jane contracted one of these illnesses and she ended up dying, which was false. Mrs. Reed expresses her hatred towards Jane. She wished that Jane had died at Lowood when the illnesses were spreading. The reason behind Mrs. Reed's hate for Jane was because she was always Mr. Reed's favorite. So now this was a very good explanation to all that, bitterness Mrs. Reed had towards Jane. There was always, whenever someone dislikes someone or hates someone or resents someone, there's always a reason behind it. And now we finally find out why Mrs. Reed had hated Jane, because Jane's maternal uncle, which is Mrs. Reed's husband, has always loved Jane and nourished Jane so much, so that, made Mrs. Reed hate her and caused Mrs. Reed to treat Jane horribly. So that's what happened, and Mrs. Reed, being the very cool person she is, had wished death upon Jane. She admits that she regrets breaking her late husband's request, which was to take care of Jane as if she were her own. Mrs. Reed apologizes for that. At midnight, Mrs. Reed passes away. Not one tear was shed. So even Mrs. Reed's children had no remorse, and they did not have any feelings towards their mother's death. Usually when a person's parent dies, that person goes through a lot. They are emotionally damaged. They cry for months, if not years. Yet her children did not have any emotion, and Jane, she could not have emotion, but now we have reason, we have the reason behind Mrs. Reed's hate for Jane, which was Mr. Reed's love for Jane, his unconditional love for Jane. Chapter 22. Jane intended on staying at Gateshead for a week, but ended up staying for a month. She got to know more about her cousins who kept bickering. Georgiana went to London and married a rich man. Eliza went to a French convent. On her way back to Thornfield, Jane reflects about her childhood and she did not want to revisit it. So basically, Jane had a lot of things left in her childhood, including abuse, and she did not want to think about it again. She wanted to just leave it in the past and not revisit it. Both Gateshead and Lowood were not the most suitable places for a pleasant childhood. So basically, at Gateshead, she suffered abuse and being belittled constantly. And at Lowood, she basically, saw many of her friends die, and she, suffered poverty and always sleeping with an empty stomach. And she was also always overworked, so she was never nourished. She thought about who missed her at Thornfield. She knew that Mrs. Fairfax and Adele did, but the one she was thinking about was not thinking about her. So basically, we can all tell that that's Mr. Rochester. Jane stopped at Mellicott and decided to walk to Thornfield. On her way, she saw Mr. Rochester. She tried going another way, but it was too late. Then he tells her about the new carriage for his future wife. By the end of the conversation, Jane expressed her happiness around him and he smiled. So Jane, saw Mr. Rochester and she wanted to stay away because Jane, being the person again with strong morals, she wanted to be as far away from him as she can because she didn't want her feelings to increase. But they did. In the end, Jane ended up expressing her happiness around him, and till now he has been showing signs that he has liked her, because he did smile and he did bite his lips, and he always asked her questions that were not appropriate between a boss and a governess. Chapter 23. So this chapter is really, really good, guys. It's a really good chapter. My favorite chapter of the whole book. It was a beautiful summer. Adele was gathering strawberries, then went to bed. After Adele went to bed, Jane sat in the garden, since it was the most beautiful hour of the day. Afterwards, she smelled Mr. Rochester's cigar. It smelled like musk. Jane planned on leaving, but figured that he would not see her. So she stayed. He walked forward, so Jane attempted to leave. When she saw him, she thought, oh, well, he won't see me, it's fine. But then when he was, approaching her, she was like, oh my God, I have to go. But then she ended up staying because it was too late. He walked forward, so Jane attempted to leave, but he called her to show her something. And they walk, and he tells her that he is ready to marry Blanche. He proceeds to tell her more shocking news, which is her departure from Thornfield. He plans on sending Adele to school and Jane to an Irish family in order to keep distance. So there's a reason he wants to keep distance. He tells her that they will spend time together even though they should not. So forbidden relationship in some kind of sort. He says that his ribs have a sting when he is with her. Jane confesses her love towards him, which she could no longer conceal. She tells him if she were any richer, he would be feeling the way she is feeling. So basically, that's kind of social class discrimination because, she's the governess and she's the one who has a lower social class than him. So she's the one being hurt. He asks her to be his wife and Jane accepts. He tells her to call him by his first name, Edward. So we learn that his name's Edward. He tells her that he never loved Blanche, and after he told her that he was not very wealthy, she and her mother changed. So basically, when Mr. Rochester dressed as a gypsy, he ended up telling Blanche, when Blanche went for her reading, that Rochester is not rich. And that's why Blanche was very upset, because Blanche was obviously, wanting his money. And when she was informed that he did not have money, her attitude completely changed, which shows who she really is. Jane was not sure if he was being honest, so she was skeptical. When it rains, they go inside and kiss 3 times, and Mrs. Fairfax sees them. And in the next chapter, we will learn about Mrs. Fairfax's point of view and how she feels about this relationship. 24, very long. Jane woke up feeling happier than ever, yet not sure if yesterday was a dream. She was waiting for Mr. Rochester to confirm it. She wore a summer dress and looked at her reflection on the mirror peacefully. So basically, she was finally content. She was finally fulfilled and felt peace, since she knew she was enough for her master. She had seen a homeless woman and her son, and she gave them all the money she had in her purse. So basically, when you're happy, you take decisions like that. Um, then she had breakfast with Mrs. Fairfax, who seemed cold and very quiet. After that, Jane goes to Mr. Rochester and he informs her that their wedding day will be in 4 weeks. He called his banker and he told Jane that he would shower her with jewels and make her travel. Jane refused the jewels. Then she asks him why he stayed with Blanche all this time, and he told her that jealousy is his best ally. So basically, when Mr. Rochester would make Jane stay these nights when he was with his guests, basically it was to make Jane jealous, according to him. And another thing is that we learn that Jane did not want Mr. Rochester for his money, and we do know that her feelings for him are authentic, and she actually does love him a lot. But she did not refuse the travels because we always know that Jane's that adventurous person who is always longing for adventure. So, Jane asked if Blanche's feelings were hurt after all this happened. Mr. Rochester said she was fine and she was only in it for the money. As I previously said, Jane asks Mr. Rochester to explain the situation to Mrs. Fairfax, and he accepts because Jane, Mrs. Fairfax meant a lot to Jane, and she didn't want, that strain between her and Mrs. Fairfax. After Mr. Rochester went to explain the situation to Mrs. Fairfax, Jane went to talk to her. Mrs. Fairfax expresses her disapproval because they have a large age gap and they come from different social classes. So again, social class discrimination. Then Adele rushed in, which relieved Jane because Mrs. Fairfax kept warning her about the dangers of marrying Mr. Rochester. And she was kind of, right. There are many dangers, which we'll read about later. Adele wanted to go with them to Melcott, but Mr. Rochester refused. But Jane sided with Adele and insisted that she join them. Once they arrived at Melcott, Mr. Rochester wanted to buy Jane a dozen dresses, but she reduced them to 2. So, Jane, again, she wasn't that greedy person. The more stuff Mr. Rochester bought her, the more her face turned red with a sense of degradation and annoyance. On the way back, Jane remembered her uncle's letter and how easier her life would have been if he had adopted her. So she was wondering, what if this happened, what if that happened? Mr. Rochester would want her more. So basically, this is again, it has to do with social classes. So Jane felt like she wasn't good enough for Mr. Rochester and they were not equals. Therefore, it made her feel insecure. And she always wondered, what if, what that, And then Jane demands that she remains Adele's governess and will get £30 per annum. Mr. Rochester asked her to have dinner, but she declined since she wanted everything to be normal for the next 4 weeks. Mr. Rochester did not like that. So obviously, Jane was having this kind of internal conflict where she felt like she was less than him and she just didn't feel good about it, as you can see. Like, it wasn't all peace. They continued to see each other at 7. They would tease each other, but love was not said often. Chapter 25. The night before the wedding, Jane was waiting for Mr. Rochester to come back from a business trip. She goes outside and finds a split chestnut tree. So the split chestnut tree is a big sign of foreshadowing. That scared her. She was scared of being separated from Mr. Rochester or something happening to him with the bad weather. So she goes out determined to find him. It was raining and it was very windy. She sees Mr. Rochester and rushes to him. When they get to the house, Jane tells him what she experienced and how she felt. The same night, Jane's wedding dress and veil arrived. They were a gift from Mr. Rochester. Later that night, Jane is sleeping and has a bad dream. Then she has a second one and wakes up, only to find a scary woman ripping her veil in half. She tells Mr. Rochester and he gives her an explanation which did not sound very convincing. So basically his explanation did not make much sense. She said that she was not satisfied with it, she said she was satisfied with it, though she was actually not. So basically she lied, but deep down, she didn't really feel like it was, a valid one, a good one. She goes to the nursery and sleeps next to Adele. She was sad that she would have to leave her. So basically, this chapter is kind of sad. So throughout this chapter, Jane sees this split chestnut tree. And we can all tell that that's actually foreshadowing that her and Mr. Rochester will end up, being split. And then Jane gets so scared of being separated from him because she was so happy that they were together that she goes out in search of him. Then she finds him. And then the same night that wedding dress, rips, that wedding veil actually rips, And that shows that there is something wrong and off going on, and the gothic atmosphere of Thornfield keeps getting worse and worse. Then Jane goes and sleeps next to Adele, and she was very sad that she was leaving Adele, and she cried. So this is it, guys, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked this, and I hope this made it clear. If you had any questions in the comments or anything about foreshadowing or anything that I mentioned that's new, please ask me and I will answer. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like if you actually like that video, and please subscribe if you want to. Bye, guys.